All right. Hi, everyone. Again, I hope you're all keeping well. My name is Rahul, for those of you who don't know me as yet, one of the co-founders of Travel the Unknown. Thank you for joining us today. This time we're taking you to Georgia, which is situated in the Caucasus region of Europe. For those of you who have attended our previous talks, we've changed the order slightly based on the feedback that we've received. So after I go through some general housekeeping rules, I will hand straight over to Sophie, who will take you on a journey through Georgia and what you can expect there as a traveler. I will then give a brief overview of our tours there, and then we'll do a questions and answers session at the end. So if we move on to the housekeeping rules, please. Again, as mentioned, please keep your microphones muted at all times and videos disabled as well, please. Just ensure that the presentation doesn't have too much disturbance. And regarding the questions and answers sessions, as before, these should be submitted via the chat function. So for those using a desktop or a laptop, you should see a chat option at the bottom of your screen. For those using a mobile or a tablet, you should see that option via the participants button. We did have a few technical glitches earlier in the day, so please bear with us if they resurface, but hopefully they won't. And again, just to tell you a little bit about Sophie, for those of you who didn't see her during our Uzbekistan event, we know Sophie very well. She's a tourism development consultant with the World Bank and her own company, Maximum Exposure. She first visited Georgia in 2012, since when she has then returned to the country a number of times with the Georgian Tourist Board, as well as the British Georgian Chamber of Commerce, amongst others. She tells me her favorite food is Georgian food, which she seeks out wherever she travels, whether it be London or Tashkent. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who is now going to take you on a journey through Georgia.
Thank you very much, Rahul, and a very warm welcome to you this afternoon. I say very warm, not only from my heart, but also if you are in the UK, you're probably sweltering this afternoon. I understand that here in Reading, it's 32 degrees. So if I'm looking slightly stressed and slightly sweaty, it's not entirely stress, it is also partly the weather. I've called this talk Georgia 8,000 Vintages because the history, the culture, the geography and even the economy of Georgia is inextricably linked with wine. I can't even imagine one without the other. If you're lucky, this becomes evident the first moment you arrive. The immigration officials at the airport are known for giving tourists free bottles of wine when they stamp their passports. It's a welcome gesture of Georgian hospitality, a nod to their national heritage, and it sure beats the uncomfortable glares we're treated to coming back home to London. I should probably start at the very beginning. Somewhere in the Caucasus, at least 8,000 years ago, a discovery was made which revolutionised our enjoyment of food and drink. If you take your grapes, of which Georgia alone has nearly 400 indigenous varieties, squeeze them and ferment the juice, eventually you get wine. Archaeologists studying the Stone Age settlement of Gadatrili Gora, 20 miles south of what is now Tbilisi, found the bases of large clay jars embedded in the floor. When they examined them in a lab, the pottery was found to contain tartaric acid, a chemical fingerprint that shows wine residues were present. Thanks to radiocarbon dating, we know that these wine jars were made somewhere between 6,000 and 5,800 BC. In the same site, there were pots decorated with grapes, and the fine soil still contained ancient grape pollen. Ever since then, wine has been an integral part of life in Georgia. The early Iron Age rock and cave city of Oplistica, which you can see in the photo here, still has its original rock-cut wine troughs, where citizens would have trampled the grapes underfoot. And there are wine cellars where the wine would have been fermented and then been stored. Here, pagan and then later early Christian architecture were combined. And for more than 1,500 years, it was a stronghold in the centre of Georgia, until it was finally destroyed by the Mongol invasion. It was the Georgians, interestingly, who taught the ancient Greeks the art of winemaking. When you hear the names Iberia and Colchis in Greco-Roman myths, they're speaking about territories within the modern borders of Georgia. And yes, that means that Jason and the Argonauts went to Georgia in pursuit of the Golden Fleece. And if Prometheus really was chained to a rock by Zeus, punished for stealing fire, That happened in Georgia too. In fact, the Georgians can still show you Prometheus's rock, and the Prometheus Cave National Monument in Imereti is named in his honour. I want to tell you a little bit about how the Georgians make their wine, because it accounts in large part for its success. The technique, which is known as qvevri winemaking, has also been recognised by UNESCO as part of the world's intangible cultural heritage. When you make Georgian wine, everything goes into the qvevri. Not just the grape juice that you've squeezed from the grapes, but also the must, the seeds and the skins as well. This is what gives Georgian wines their unique colour. The white wines aren't wine at all, but amber. You might have heard people talk of amber or orange wines, and this is the reason for that colour. The qvevri itself is a terracotta vessel, pointed at the bottom rather like an amphora. They vary in size from perhaps 10 litres to 10,000 litres, easily big enough for me to climb inside. The outside of the qvevri is coated with lime, and the inside is lined with beeswax, keeping it watertight. It's buried in the ground before being filled, so that the wine remains at a more constant temperature throughout the fermentation process. This is one of the most important tricks the Georgians taught the ancient Greeks. If you ferment your wine above ground, with hot days and cold nights, you're likely to end up with vinegar, as there's too much change in temperature. Below ground, the temperature is constant, and therefore the wine that's produced at the end of the process is of a much higher quality. This isn't the only clever thing about the qvevri, however. Its shape is important too. As the wine ferments, the sediment sinks naturally to the bottom of the jar. So when it's ready, you can simply siphon off the liquid without the bits. This means that unlike using modern industrial wines, you don't have to filter or add sulfites to the wine before you drink it. Made in the traditional way, Georgian wine is therefore a completely natural product. On your trip to Georgia, you absolutely must visit a winery to see the qvevri wines being made. If you travel in the autumn, it's likely that you'll be able to lend a hand picking or pressing the grapes. And of course, there will be plenty of opportunity to enjoy the fruits of your labours. The Twins wine cellar in the Alanzani Valley has a small winemaking museum, and you can even stay at the vineyard in their new boutique hotel. You might wonder how Georgia managed to preserve its winemaking traditions for so long, particularly given that it was attacked so many times. The Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks all historically invaded Georgia, and their Islamic prohibition of wine should have spelled the end for Georgia's wine industry. But it didn't, and there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, the Georgians were cunning. They named one of their grape varieties Ala Dasturi. It means the one which is permitted by God. Yes, it was a medieval marketing trick, but it created a wine which at least some of the Muslim invaders were happy to drink. When you look at Georgia's national dress, the choka, which I was going to wear for you today, but given in this heat, I thought wearing pure wool was not the way forward. You might reasonably think that the tiny pockets shown into the breast are for gun cartridges, and later on they were probably used for that as well. But originally these pockets were for vine cuttings. If your village was going to be attacked, your vineyard would undoubtedly be burned. You would flee and hide in the mountains with your family, but when you could eventually return home, you needed to be able to replant the vines. The pockets were therefore a practical, fashionable feature so that you could carry the cuttings with you up into the mountains, keep them safe, and replant again when you came home. The third reason for the longevity of the wine traditions in Georgia is the Georgian Orthodox Church. If wine is one of the pillars of Georgian society, then the church is the other. Georgia was one of the first states in the world to adopt Christianity as an official religion. Saint Nino, who is known as the Enlightener of Georgia, and is equated in legal doctrine to the 12 Apostles, converted the royal house of Iberia in the 4th century AD, the early part of the 4th century. Legend has it that Saint Nino came to Georgia from Cappadocia, carrying a cross made from grapevine. It was given to her by the Virgin Mary, and you can still see the relic in Sioni Cathedral in Tbilisi. As in many places in the world, the Georgian church had land, it had money, and it had power. It was also a phenomenal patron of the arts and of learning. The architecture and the frescoes you'll see here are some of the finest anywhere in the world. Now, the monasteries of medieval Georgia doubled as universities. The Academy of Ikalto Monastery, which was founded in the 6th century, is one such example. It kept meticulous records on everything from astronomy to rhetoric, geography to grammar, and their most prized documents related to winemaking. The monks knew the exact terroir of every square of ground. They knew every variety of wine, every variety of vine, and they knew exactly which vines should be paired with which patch of ground to get the very best results. And the reason that this was so important? Wine is the blood of Christ. Every church needed communion wine, and it was considered the duty of every God-fearing winemaker to tithe a share of the wine he made to the church. This position was sometimes taken to extremes, as you can see here in this photo. What you're looking at is a tiny rural chapel at the back, and in the front of it, a heavily fortified wine cellar. In the event of an attack, the priest who worked in the chapel was expected to abandon his church and leave the altar to its fate. He had to hole up inside the wine cellar with the sacramental wine and defend it with his life. Scrolling forward to the 20th century, and I know that's a huge jump in time, Georgia became part of the Soviet Union. And with communism came an attack on the church, which nearly destroyed it. Priests were purged, sent to Siberia, or killed. Monasteries were destroyed, and their libraries were burned. Knowledge which they had nurtured for a millennium or more was lost, and the traditional ways of winemaking were replaced with industrial processes. Volume, not quality, was the priority. As cut off from the bulk of producers in capitalist West, Georgia was expected to be the main wine supplier for the USSR. Some of the expertise which was lost can never be replaced. But thankfully, since independence in 1991, a new generation of Georgian winemakers has started to recover this ancient knowledge and build a new, more sustainable wine industry using traditional practices. One of these winemakers is Eko Glonti, who began his career during the Soviet period as an anaesthetist, then became a geologist after independence, and now has settled in his final calling, making wine. Eko uses indigenous grape varieties and traditional methods to make some of the very best wines in Georgia. His Lagvinari brand is available in the UK in restaurants such as the Fat Duck and also at the Ritz, and his wines have won numerous awards. I'm very fortunate to call him a friend. Four years ago, I took a group of international journalists to attend the first UNWTO Global Conference on Wine Tourism. Georgia, as the birthplace of wine, was the obvious location for the event. And as an add-on to the official programme, I wanted the journalists to meet Eko. As Eko is often understandably out in his vineyards, I'd arranged the meeting through his partner Marco. The 12 of us, journalists, our guide David and me, would come to their beautifully restored house in one of the old districts of Tbilisi after dinner, arriving around 10 p.m. for a wine tasting. Time in Georgia is somewhat of a fluid concept, and we were on the doorstep just before 11. Eko opened the door, smiled at us all through the darkness of the night, and welcomed us indoors to his home. We had the most wonderful time, worked our way through almost 30 bottles of his wine, and left for our hotel about 3 o'clock in the morning. Without a shadow of a doubt, that evening was the highlight of the trip. What I discovered the following day, however, was that Marco had forgotten to tell Eko we were coming. The poor man had been faced with a dozen guests, 11 of whom he'd never even met before, at the door, just when he should have been going to bed. He didn't even blink. He welcomed us in, laid the table with cheese and bread, and poured endless bottles of the wine from his cellar. To me, this really epitomizes Georgian hospitality. It doesn't matter who the guest is or what time of day or night it is. The welcome is always warm. The wine flows, and over the course of a few hours, strangers turn into friends. So far, I've talked an awful lot about wine. It's unavoidable, I suppose. But I've also touched on some history, Georgian hospitality, and the cultural importance of the church. I'm going to delve now a little more into the cultural sites, because although Georgia boasts extraordinary scenery and huge opportunities for active travel, visiting these monuments are an unforgettable part of any Travel the Unknown tour. You'll likely fly into Georgia's capital, Tbilisi. I think it's my favourite city in the world, and if you said to me you have to pick somewhere to live, work and play, but can never leave, I wouldn't have to think twice. The old town in Tbilisi is quirky, it's dripping with history and an eclectic combination of architectural styles, from the domed sulphur baths you can see in the foreground here, to the tall houses with their painted balconies, and the Narikala fortress standing guard on the ridge. Some of my very happiest memories in Georgia involve sitting out in a cafe on one of the squares in the old town, chatting on a warm summer's night until the early hours, surrounded by the babble of chatter and buskers. There are churches in Tbilisi, of course, but if your time in the city is limited, there are other things you should prioritise. I recommend taking the funicular up to the fortress for the very best views of the city, and then walking down into either the old town or the botanical gardens, which, surprisingly enough, is right in the city centre. I know that Travel the Unknown will take you to the dry bridge for the flea market, which is an excellent spot for souvenir shopping. And you must also pop by the Gabriadze Puppet Theatre, the Peace Bridge and the wonderful Moorish Opera House, where you can also see the ballet. The unmissable churches in Georgia are the Cathedral of the Living Pillar and Javari Monastery at Mshketa, and Gelati Monastery near Kutaisi. These three buildings are all UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the oldest parts of which date back to the 5th century. The buildings are sacred sites, of course, and they attract large numbers of Georgian pilgrims, especially during Holy Week. I appreciate and I respect their religious significance, but for me personally, it is the artworks in these churches and monasteries which make me sit or stand in awe. I could spend hours just looking at the frescoes, which cover every surface of the interiors and depict both religious and historical scenes. On the whole, the paintings have been preserved but not restored, so you are seeing them in their original state. There are some wonderful Byzantine-style mosaics at Gelati too, attesting to the strong cultural links which the monks had with monasteries in what is now Istanbul during the late 11th and early 12th centuries. If you're fortunate, you'll be able to hear Georgian polyphonic singing during your visit. The acoustics in the churches are out of this world, and it's a musical tradition very closely tied to the church, though with secular and folk variations as well. Like the Kvevari winemaking, Georgian polyphonic singing has UNESCO intangible cultural heritage status, and it sends shivers down my spine every time that I hear it. There are two other cultural sites that I want to mention near the Gelati Monastery, as I know they're included on the Travel Unknown Georgia Explorer Tour. The first of these is Vardzia, which is Georgia's second rock cave city. If you've been to Cappadocia before, you'll know what a cave city looks like when it's spread out horizontally. Well, Vardzia is a little different because it was built vertically and inside a cliff. When it was first excavated in the 12th century, the idea was that it would be completely hidden from view. Attackers wouldn't know that it was there, and so the people would be safe inside. It's only due to an earthquake that the front part of the cliff was lost, revealing the labyrinth of passages, rooms, and even a church inside. Last, and certainly not least, you have to see the Rabati fortress at Kaustica, which was first built in the 9th century, but has recently been reconstructed. The building is a reminder of how cosmopolitan medieval Georgia was. There's a mosque with a minaret and a madrasa within the fortress complex, in addition to the Orthodox church. The tunnel leading from the fortress to the river has been repaired, as have the baths and the citadel. The restoration work has been done exquisitely, right down to the layout of the gardens, where of course you will find the grapevines growing. I know that in our time this evening, I have barely scratched the surface with what to see and do in Georgia. I haven't said anything about the food, which amounts to sacrilege as it's unbelievably delicious, or the national parks, the mountains and the botanical gardens. Please accept my apologies for that. The team at Travel the Unknown are really knowledgeable. So if I don't have time to answer your questions tonight, do send them an email or have a look at the Georgian Tourism Board website. Georgia, like many countries, will be reopening for international tourism in stages from the 1st of July. We don't yet have a date for when Georgian Airways Gatwick to Tbilisi flight will resume, but when it does, I can't think of a better tour operator to go with than Travel the Unknown. They will really look after you and ensure that you see and experience the very best that Georgia has to offer.
Thank you, Sophie. Okay, so thanks again, Sophie, for giving us an insight into Georgia. I just want to go through again a little bit about Travel the Unknown and what we do in Georgia. So for those of you who don't know us that well yet, we organize small group tours up to a maximum of 12 people. We regularly organize tailor-made and private trips, and someone from the team has been to Georgia and the surrounding countries, so we have intimate personal knowledge of each of our destinations. Over the years, we've identified and worked with the best local partners, and we've got to really know some of the guides very, very well there. We've also been recommended by the major guidebooks. As you can see, we are fully financially protected and atoll bonded. So going on to our tours, for those wanting an in-depth view and understanding of Georgia, Sophie mentioned our Georgia Explorer trip. It's a 12-day trip. And you may recognize some of the places mentioned on the slide. And this tour focuses very much on understanding Georgia from a cultural point of view and also exploring its various landscapes. Again, as Sophie mentioned, Tbilisi is probably one of the most attractive capital cities in the world. So one can easily add on a few extra days before or after the tour there as well. On to our next trip, which is the best of the Caucasus, which is a 15-day trip. For those wanting to explore Georgia as well as the neighboring countries, this is a really nice option, which starts in Azerbaijan and then works its way through Georgia and then finally finishing in Armenia. This is usually one of our most popular trips in that region. And the other tour which features Georgia is our Armenia and Georgia Explorer tour. Again, it's 12 days, similar to the Georgia Explorer tour, starting in Armenia and then works its way up into Georgia. And again, all information for these trips can be found on our website. All right, I'm going to move on to the questions and answers now. So if anyone does have any questions, if they could please send those via the chat, and Sophie and myself will be more than happy to answer those. Okay, Sophie, so, I mean, as you obviously talked about wine, one question that's come in is all of the wine produced in the Kakheti region of Georgia?
No, there are a number of different wine regions within Georgia. Kakheti is the most famous, and as a tourist, it's where most people are likely to see the wine because it's very close to Tbilisi, it's very easily accessible, there's very good accommodation. But there are different wine areas within Georgia. They all have slightly different terroir and different characteristics to the wine. So if you are a serious wine enthusiast, I recommend doing a number of wine tours in different parts of the country to appreciate the full variety of wines which Georgia can produce.
Okay, thanks. And when would you say is the best time to be traveling to Georgia?
It depends what you want to do. If you want to go up into the high Caucasus, up into the mountains, particularly for hiking, then I would say the best time is the summer. However, if you are going to be predominantly sightseeing, the spring and autumn are gorgeous times of year. And it's actually a destination which you can go to in the winter as well. The lowland areas, and particularly sort of Tbilisi, don't get particularly cold. So I've been there in December, February sort of time. And yes, you need a coat, but it's not like going to Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's not uncomfortably cold in winter. And of course, if you are a ski enthusiast, there's some pretty good skiing in Georgia as well. So you can combine culture in Tbilisi and a little bit of skiing as well.
Great. Sophie, you also mentioned food in particular. Are there any highlights that you have or any recommendations for anyone?
I would say that if you're going to Georgia, pack some trousers 2 sizes larger than the ones you normally wear, because bread and cheese and cream and butter feature very, very heavily in the cooking. The food in Georgia is absolutely fantastic. The national dish, I suppose, which some of you will have heard of, is called khachapuri. And it's, in my favourite variant, is a sort of a boat made out of bread that is filled with melted cheese and then with an egg broken on top. Other foods which are very, very popular are, there's a lot of aubergine, in particular a dish which is grilled aubergine rolls stuffed with walnut paste and pomegranate seeds. Pakali, which is a starter, again with it's a sort of a walnut paste with spinach for the green one, with beetroot for the purple one. Lots of very, very good stews, particularly lamb, chicken, some kebabs as well, and khinkali, which are steamed dumplings, usually with meat, but could also be filled with pumpkin or vegetables as well. So you will eat huge quantities in Georgia. You will thoroughly enjoy every meal, with or without wine. And whenever I am traveling, I look to see if there is a Georgian restaurant, because I know the food will always be good wherever I am in the world.
Sure, great. In terms of any no-go areas, obviously there's a few breakaway regions of Georgia. I mean, do you have any comments on those?
There are 2 provinces of Georgia which are occupied by Russia. As a tourist, you won't be going to them. One, because it's very difficult to cross because of the ways that the Russians control the border, but also from a security point of view. But there's no way as a general tourist you could accidentally stray into those areas. So I wouldn't worry about that. They're not areas that you would accidentally end up in.
Okay. And someone's asked if you could maybe give a bit more information about Svaneti in particular. If you are a mountain person and if you like wildernesses and hiking, Svaneti is a fantastic area. It's a region in the north of Georgia. It's relatively inaccessible. So if you're only going to go for a week, 10 days, you probably wouldn't have the opportunity to go. But if you're planning a longer trip in Georgia, I would highly recommend going up into Svaneti as well. And you will see cultures there which are quite different from other parts of Georgia, because the populations were relatively cut off for much of their development. They weren't affected to the same extent by invasions. So often people there have kept their own language, for example. You will also see fascinating defensive towers, which are UNESCO protected structures. So the architecture is quite different from in other places as well. Okay, great. Someone's also asked in terms of, I guess, which of our tours would be best for one looking for a cultural experience. I guess I would say the Georgia Explorer tour if you're looking primarily at Georgia. Otherwise, Armenia and Georgia Explorer is also a very good trip, which will give you kind of plenty of insight into Georgia as well. Again, what tends to be quite common is for people maybe to do, if they want to join a small group trip, they join that. And then if they want some extra days or extra time after or before the trip, then that can be arranged and you can do things as per your own interests. And again, as I said, during when I was talking about the tours, is for those who may not, maybe traveling there to that region for the first time and would like to see the contrast between countries, then the best of the Caucasus trip as well is a very good one, because Azerbaijan is quite distinctly different from Georgia and Armenia. So I just wanted to mention that. Sophie, in terms of accommodation options in Georgia, I mean, how have you found those on your trips? There is a huge variety. The Rooms Hotel in Tbilisi a couple of years ago was voted by Monocle magazine as the best hotel in the world. And the group that it belongs to is a local Georgian group. They have a number of fantastic hotels in Kazbegi in the north, which is on the map here, plus a couple of hotels in Tbilisi and elsewhere. They are design hotels, absolutely top standard, fantastic service, great facilities, really quirky design. So you've got properties like that. You've got big international hotels. If you want to stay in a Radisson or a Marriott, there are those sorts of properties. But then there are an awful lot of Georgian boutique hotels, which I highly recommend.
There are hotels and guest houses on a number of the vineyards, and also in some of the quirky out-of-the-way locations. So you certainly won't have a problem with accommodation. It's just a case of choosing the accommodation which suits your particular tastes. And I'm sure Travel the Unknown can advise on that, and you will have favourites.
Absolutely. And could you also give any kind of your own experience in terms of traveling around the country by road? How did you find them generally?
Road travel is mixed. It depends where you're going. If you're traveling on fairly main roads, they're in reasonable condition. Outside of Tbilisi, there's rarely much traffic. So the issue then is what the road surface is like. The main roads are reasonable quality, certainly travelling between Tbilisi and Kutaisi, for example, or going to Batumi on the coast, the roads are good. If you're going up into the mountains, the further you go away from civilization, in inverted commas, the worse the roads become. But that's, I think, pretty much the same as in the UK. If I go down to my parents' village in Wiltshire, beware the roads.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of the main kind of Byzantine churches and monasteries, how far are they typically from Tbilisi, the main ones that you mentioned?
So the Javari Monastery and the Cathedral of the Living Pillar are less than an hour outside of Tbilisi. So a lot of people will stay in Tbilisi and go out to Mushketa, where they are, on even a half-day trip. That's very, very easy. Sioni Cathedral is in Tbilisi itself. There are a number of smaller churches there. And then if you drive from Tbilisi to Kutaisi, which is where the Gelati Monastery is, that's about 2 hours, 2.5 hours drive. Mm-hmm. So it's a relatively small country. And providing you are going between major destinations where there is a good road travel is therefore quite quick.
Okay, it looks like a lot of people obviously like their wine, and they're asking for any wine recommendations, Georgian wine recommendations you can give.
Well, I've already spoken to you about Echo's wine like Vinari. You can get that online. You can get it from Hedonism, the wine shop in Mayfair. There's, where else is very, very... Chateau Morani is another popular wine. Another vineyard that's quite well known internationally is called Pheasant's Tears. The important thing is when you're looking at Georgian wine is to check whether it is a Qvevri wine made in the traditional style or whether it is a European style wine. The European style wines, some of them these days are very, very good, but they're made using the same industrial processes that you'd get in Italy or France. So you're not going to get the characteristic taste of the traditional wines if you go for one that's been made in European style. Look for the Qvevri wines. They are more expensive. They're also very, very dry. So if you like your sweet wines, it's probably not going to be to your taste. But if you like a very earthy, dry wine, look out for the Qvevri wines.
Right. Okay. I mean, I know we generally kind of have been staying away from COVID questions, but from your interactions, I guess, with the Georgian Tourism Board and the ministry there, I mean, how is Georgia generally handled or, coping with the situation?
So far, so good. Georgia shut down quite early and quite strictly. They've had relatively few cases. They are hoping to open up for tourism from the 1st of July onwards. The issue is going to be not that the Georgians want to open up, but whether the airlines are flying and what the status is in the countries that tourists are coming from. I know there are talks of sort of air bridges for us to other parts of Europe, and I'm sure Georgia is having similar conversations with other countries about reciprocal opening for tourism. But it will very much depend on what the COVID situation is at either end of the flight, because even if Georgia is in a good place, if the country you're flying from isn't, you may not be able to enter for a few months. But I would hope by the autumn Georgia will be opening for tourism, and I would have thought that the 2021 season will be, touch wood, more or less back to normal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we hope for the same. One point I guess I didn't mention when I was discussing our tours, that region is actually quite unique in the sense that it's all done by road. So there's no domestic or regional flights, which, makes the travel that much more interesting as well. And I think as Sophie kind of alluded to, some of the landscapes in Georgia in particular, are absolutely staggering. So again, just bear that in mind, when you're considering, if you are considering traveling to that region, that it's done by road, but in comfortable vehicles. And yeah, it's so far, for all the years that we've been running these trips, they've gone exceptionally well. Any other tips?
Notice somebody, and this is one that I'm going to give a plug for a couple of restaurants for. Somebody has said, can you recommend any Georgian restaurants in London? There's quite a number of Georgian restaurants in London, all of which are good. But the one I would say particularly recommend is Little Georgia, which is in Angel, Islington. And then if you are on sort of west of London, I'm in Reading. There is a fantastic Little Georgian cafe in Caversham, of all places, right on the Thames, very close to Reading, called Geo Cafe. They have been keeping me well fed during lockdown, and they also deliver Georgian spices. So if you fancy making some Georgian food at home whilst you're self-isolating, get in touch with Geo Cafe in Caversham, and I'm sure they'll be able to send you all of the spices you need and the recipes to have a go at making Georgian food yourself.
Okay, perfect. Great. And again, someone has just also mentioned the Georgian Wine Society that we'll get in touch with as well, for anyone really interested in the wine side of things. Any other tips, Sophie, that you would have for a first-time visitor to Georgia?
Take an extra bag for shopping. There are some fantastic carpets in particular, but also I know you include the Drybridge flea market on your list. I always end up buying all sorts of weird and wonderful curios from there, mostly 20th century antiques, not necessarily antiques, but glorified bric-a-brac and Soviet era paraphernalia. There's also quite an interesting art scene, contemporary art scene, particularly in Tbilisi. So there are quite a lot of galleries and studios, and it's always, when I'm traveling, I like to see what's happening creatively in a city. Tbilisi, although it has a huge amount of history, is also a city with a very vibrant contemporary creative scene for everything from electronic music and dance to graffiti art. So I think there's all sorts of opportunities for shopping whilst you're in the country and for bringing a little bit of Georgia home.
In terms of, I guess, for shopping in particular, I mean, what currency do you recommend people carry with them when they're traveling there?
The easiest thing is just to take your standard bank card and withdraw the local currency from ATMs when you're there. ATMs are very widely available. The main banks in Georgia are very credible, so you don't have to worry about your card. I think both Bank of Georgia and TBC, which is the two big banks in Georgia, are both listed on the London Stock Exchange. The banking infrastructure is fairly good, so it's not that you're going to have to carry around big wadges of cash with you. You can just get out cash when you need it, and a lot of restaurants and shops will take card payments. It's only really for the markets and smaller shops where you'd want to have Georgian lari, the local currency. Mm-hmm.
And someone just also asked again about the flights from the UK to Georgia. I think, Sophie, as you mentioned earlier, that Georgian Airways would be typically the flight to take.
Yeah, so up until COVID, there were 2 direct flight options from the UK. So you could fly with Georgian Airways from Gatwick to Tbilisi, and you could fly with Wizz Air from London Luton to Kutaisi. Wizz Air have mothballed their Kutaisi flight for the foreseeable future. We don't know if and when that will be resumed. So at the moment, if you want to fly direct, it's going to be Georgian Airways Gatwick to Tbilisi, or you can fly via Istanbul with Turkish Airlines, who are also a good option.
Okay. Great. And the final question, Sophie, is how much English is typically spoken in Georgia, or is any other kind of Western European language useful?
The official language is Georgian. A lot of older people still speak Russian because they were educated during the Soviet period, but the younger generation are learning English because that is, one, because tourism has become very, very important in the country, but also Georgia is increasingly well connected with Europe and with the US, and young people see that if they want to study abroad, if they want to work for foreign companies, English is absolutely key. So if you're in tourist areas or meeting anybody who's involved with the tourism industry, whether it's guides, drivers, hotel staff, they will all speak English to varying degrees. Some of them will speak very, very good English.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you, Sophie. Thanks again for speaking for us and enlightening us all about a bit more about Georgia. And again, if you have any kind of questions about Georgia or the wider Caucasus region, do drop us an email. You can find details on our website. We are going to continue hosting more online events in the coming months. So again, look out for our newsletter, which will tell you more information on that. We will also be sending out a newsletter very shortly about a new scheme we're going to run, which is on zero deposits if you wish to book a holiday. So again, look out for that in the coming week. And again, thank you, Sophie, for being available this evening, and also to all of you for joining our talk again. Thanks, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.